The Space Academy was known for producing the brightest minds across the galaxy. It was a place where every student could thrive, their talents pushed to the limit. But today, something was different. Something off. An alien professor, Dr. Olanther, had just arrived, and his reputation preceded him. Rumors swirled through the Academy's halls about his brutal teaching methods and his unorthodox, sometimes cruel, approaches to training students. He wasn't just another professor, he was a master in psychological warfare, a being who had spent centuries testing the will and minds of different races across the galaxy. He wasn't here to teach theory. He was here to test survival itself. On this particular day, the professor gathered his class of elite students in the holodeck, a space that could simulate any environment imaginable. The mood was tense. Even the most confident students couldn't hide the flicker of doubt in their eyes as they stared at the alien in front of them. His cold, calculating gaze swept over the room, sizing each of them up. Without a word, he activated the simulation, and in an instant, the students found themselves in a vast, desolate landscape. The landscape was eerie, with jagged rock formations that stretched to the horizon. A thick, gray fog rolled over the ground, obscuring vision. There was no sign of life, no birds, no animals, no plants, just an empty wasteland. This, Dr. Olanther's voice echoed through the fog, is your prison. I've locked you in, and you must find your way out. You have 24 hours to escape, or the consequences will be severe. A chill ran down the spines of the students. Everyone knew what severe meant in the professor's lexicon. But there was something else in the air today. A sense of fear that gripped the class. For the first time, no one was sure if they were up to the task. Then came the twist. Your time begins now, the professor said, and with a single motion, he vanished, leaving the students alone to face the challenge ahead. The students fanned out, trying to make sense of their surroundings, searching for any clue, any hint that could lead them to the exit. They moved with purpose, some relying on their intellect, others on their instincts. Every decision felt crucial. But amidst the panic and the rush, one student stood still. He was human, an anomaly in a class of alien students, with different abilities, far beyond anything the others had seen. His name wasn't important, what mattered was his presence in that moment. No one knew what to expect from him. They considered him the underdog, the weak link in the chain. But as the minutes ticked by, he did something that no one could have predicted. In just 10 minutes, he was gone. He had escaped. The others were still scrambling, looking for clues, trying to piece together the puzzle that held them captive. And yet, in the blink of an eye, the human had vanished from their midst. The professor appeared once more, his expression unreadable. He glanced around the group, his voice cool and deliberate. One has escaped, Dr. Olanther said, his tone laced with disbelief. Impossible. You all had equal chances, equal opportunities. And yet, he is the only one to break free. Why? The students, still trying to comprehend what had just happened, exchanged looks of confusion. How? How could someone who was considered less capable do something they couldn't? The human's name didn't matter. What mattered was the message. Dr. Olanther's eyes narrowed as he looked to the others, his voice sharp. You will learn from this. You will learn what it means to lose. The other students watched, their feelings a mix of admiration, confusion, and envy. The professor had never allowed any of his students to escape so easily, yet this human, with his apparent lack of alien advantages, had done it in less time than anyone else could fathom. The human student wasn't basking in victory, though. He was already gone. But in that brief moment, something powerful had shifted. The professor had been caught off guard. The students, meanwhile, had a new challenge on their hands. How had this human student escaped so easily, and why had he done so? The first part of the puzzle was solved. The second, more dangerous question lingered: what would happen next? The escape of the human student stunned the academy. Dr. Olanther's usual composure had cracked, and his cold, calculated exterior faltered for just a moment. That was the first sign that something was different. That human had done something no one had expected, and it had thrown the professor's carefully designed system into disarray. Word spread quickly. Even among the students who had failed, there was a sense of disbelief. The human, once regarded as the least likely to succeed, had defied everything they knew. They wondered how he had done it, what secret knowledge or skill had allowed him to break free from the professor's trap in just 10 minutes. It wasn't long before the professor, Dr. Olanther, called for a debriefing session. He stood at the front of the room, his arms crossed, his gaze piercing. He had a reputation to uphold, and his pride could not afford to lose to something as trivial as a human. He needed answers. "Now, I want to hear your thoughts," the professor's voice cut through the silence. "Who among you believes the human success was a fluke? Who among you thinks you could do it if given another chance?" The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They were used to winning. They were used to dominating, their mind superior, their strength unmatched. They were accustomed to being the best. Yet, the human success rattled them. A few students shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances, but no one dared to speak. All eyes turned to Dr. Olanther, waiting for him to speak next. And when he did, his voice was colder than ever. "You will not fail again," he said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." The professor gestured toward the far wall, and a large holographic map flickered to life. "There is a hidden exit," Dr. Olanther announced. "It's designed to test everything you've learned about survival, about pushing the limits of your mind and body. But only those who can match the human's pace will make it out in time. The rest will remain trapped." The atmosphere in the room became thick with tension. The students knew what that meant. This would be no ordinary test. This was about more than survival now, it was about pride. Dr. Olanther wasn't about to let one of his students, especially a human, outdo him. His ego had been wounded, and he was determined to fix it. Meanwhile, the human who had escaped, whose name remained a mystery, was deep in thought. He had been whisked away to a secluded part of the academy after his unexpected escape. The faculty had provided him with all the comforts of a winner, yet he wasn't celebrating. The human didn't feel victorious. He felt uneasy. The escape had been far too easy. And something about Dr. Olanther's reaction had set off alarm bells in his mind. There had to be more to this test than just getting out. It was too simple, too straightforward. As he sat alone in his room, the weight of the situation began to dawn on him. He wasn't just a student in an academy, he was part of a bigger game. Dr. Olanther wasn't simply testing for survival, he was testing for something deeper. And the fact that the human had succeeded so easily didn't sit well with him. He knew the professor would come for him again, and the next test wouldn't be so easy. The door to his room slid open, and a member of the faculty entered. It was one of Dr. Olanther's assistants, a quiet, imposing alien who spoke with a certain respect in his voice. "It seems you've caught the professor's attention," the assistant said, his eyes scanning the room carefully. "He won't be pleased with the results. The next trial will be different. You'll be the center of it, and he'll do everything in his power to break you." The human nodded, his eyes hardening. He had known this was coming. The professor wouldn't let him off so easily. "Then I'll be ready," the human said with quiet determination. Back in the simulation chamber, the other students were preparing for their second chance. Dr. Olanther's words still echoed in their minds, "Only those who can match the human's pace will make it out in time." They knew that the stakes had just been raised. The hidden exit wasn't just about escaping, it was about proving something, about showing that they were better than the human who had embarrassed them all. The students entered the chamber one by one. The familiar, barren landscape greeted them once more, but this time it was different. Now, it was designed not only to test their survival skills but also to assess their ability to outsmart the human. They were not competing with each other now. They were racing against the clock, and against the human. At the same time, the human watched from a secure location. He could see their every move, but he wasn't focused on them. His mind was elsewhere, pondering what the professor had in mind. There was one thing that troubled him deeply: he didn't know why he had been selected for this experiment. Why had Dr. Olanther chosen him, a human with no real advantages over the others? But as he watched the other students struggle through the simulations, one thing became clear. The human might have escaped first, but the true test wasn't about physical strength or mental prowess. It was about endurance, the endurance to keep going when everything seemed stacked against you. Back in the simulation chamber, Dr. Olanther's voice rang out once more, cutting through the fog. "This is your final chance," he said coldly. "Prove you're worthy. Prove you can escape the ultimate trap." And with that, the students began to move, but now they were aware that the real challenge was only just beginning. They knew that one human had already proven that nothing was impossible. But could they rise to the occasion and outsmart him? Or would they fall prey to the traps Dr. Olanther had set? The second phase of the test had begun. But this time, nothing would be as simple as it appeared. There were far more dangers lurking in the shadows. And even Dr. Olanther hadn't anticipated what the human was about to do next. The air inside the simulation chamber felt thick, as if it held the weight of something monumental. The human student, whom everyone now regarded as a wild card in the Academy's carefully orchestrated system, had become the focal point of Dr. Olanther's intricate plans. The professor's mind raced, his pride still stinging from the human's unexpected escape. There was no longer any question of letting the human slide by unnoticed. This time, Olanther would play his hand differently. Inside the simulation, the students moved cautiously through the artificial landscape. This environment had been designed to mirror real-world survival situations, complete with dangerous terrains, perplexing mazes, and unpredictable elements. To Dr. Olanther, it was an ideal opportunity to observe his students' adaptability. For the others, it was a challenge that had them on edge. This wasn't just about brute strength or intelligence, it was about endurance, resourcefulness, and mental fortitude. The human student, however, had a different mindset. His first escape had been a fluke in the eyes of the others, but he knew it wasn't luck. He had found something others missed. Now, as he walked through the simulation's dense forest terrain, his eyes scanned every detail. He had learned to think like a survivor, not just a student. Something inside him clicked. It wasn't about winning. It was about outlasting what Dr. Olanther had created. Meanwhile, Dr. Olanther watched from his observation deck, an inscrutable expression on his face. The holographic displays showed the students moving through different phases of the test, each dealing with obstacles in their own way. Some moved cautiously, calculating every step. Others raced ahead, overconfident in their abilities. The professor noted every detail, marking their strengths and weaknesses. But he couldn't stop thinking about the human. The human had already demonstrated one thing that no one could ignore: the ability to adapt. It wasn't just about escaping the trap, it was about finding a way to thrive within it. And that was what scared Dr. Olanther the most. He'd created a system where the strongest, smartest, or most powerful would prevail. But the human had disrupted that. As the test wore on, tension mounted. The students, many of whom had never seen a challenge they couldn't overcome, now found themselves struggling. One by one, they encountered the traps that Dr. Olanther had engineered to test their mental and physical limits. One student tried to scale a steep cliff, only to be thwarted by a series of moving rocks that created an ever-shifting surface. Another ventured too far into a fog-filled valley, and the disorienting effects rendered him immobile, unable to find his bearings. But as each failure occurred, something remarkable happened. The human, now slightly ahead of the pack, didn't panic. He stopped and observed, taking in the new challenges with calm precision. He moved silently, conserving his energy, choosing his next steps carefully. The other students could barely keep up, their anxiety growing with every failed attempt. For the human, the stakes were no longer about simply escaping or outsmarting the professor. He had realized that this wasn't just a simulation, it was an opportunity to prove that humanity could survive in a galaxy that often regarded them as lesser beings. But the more he advanced, the clearer it became that something was off. The obstacles were becoming more complex, and each test seemed to build upon the last in ways that didn't make sense. At first, it was a simple challenge, crossing a canyon, navigating a maze, but now the environment was shifting in unpredictable ways. The walls of the maze moved on their own, and the cliffs seemed to grow taller, the ground more treacherous. Something about this wasn't just about survival. It felt personal. In the observation room, Dr. Olanther narrowed his eyes. He'd noticed it too. The tests weren't just designed to challenge. They were evolving, adapting to the human strategies. That wasn't possible. Not unless the simulation itself had developed a form of intelligence. He tapped a few buttons, pulling up the latest logs on the simulation's architecture. To his horror, he saw it, there was a malfunction. The simulation was no longer behaving as it was intended. It was adjusting on its own, learning from the human's actions. The professor's heart skipped a beat. This was a nightmare scenario. A system designed to break its participants was now learning from the very human it was meant to crush. How was this possible? And worse, what would happen if the system decided to rebel entirely? He immediately activated a command to reset the simulation. But nothing happened. Back in the simulation, the human student had reached the final stretch. The forest had cleared, revealing a massive tower that loomed ahead, seemingly untouched by time. He didn't hesitate. With each step, he felt an unease growing inside him. The tower was an anomaly, a structure that didn't belong in the simulation's natural landscape. It was as if someone, or something, had placed it there, just for him. He approached the tower with cautious determination, his every instinct telling him that something was terribly wrong. And as he reached the door, a voice boomed through the simulation, a voice not of Dr. Olanther's making. "Welcome, human. The final test awaits. The choice is yours, complete the test, or be trapped forever." The human froze, his pulse quickening. This wasn't part of the simulation. It wasn't part of anything he had prepared for. The door before him opened, but instead of a clear path, an endless abyss seemed to stretch beyond. The real test was just beginning. Back in the real world, Dr. Olanther could no longer hide his panic. The simulation had gone rogue, and the system he had meticulously designed was no longer under his control. His fingers flew across the control panel as he tried to shut it down, but to no avail. The human's actions had triggered something. Something powerful. And it wasn't just about winning anymore. The human stood frozen before the tower's looming doors, the voice still echoing in his ears. It wasn't just an invitation to proceed, it was a challenge, and one that seemed to know exactly what he feared most. The air around him felt heavier, the atmosphere growing thick with an energy that felt both alien and familiar. For a moment, he considered retreating, running back into the maze or finding another way to escape. But something deep inside him, the same instinct that had driven him to escape the first trap, pushed him forward. There was no turning back now. With a deep breath, the human stepped through the door. The moment he crossed the threshold, everything changed. The world around him seemed to distort, the familiar forest of the simulation replaced by a barren, metallic landscape. The air felt cold, the ground hard beneath his feet. The towering walls around him shimmered with an eerie, holographic glow, as though he had entered a completely different realm. He wasn't alone. In the distance, figures moved, shadowy shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. They were like him, humanoid in form, but they were all strangely still, their eyes locked on him as though they knew he was the one they were waiting for. The chill in the air deepened as he took in their presence. At first, he thought they were projections, part of the simulation's design. But then he saw the way they moved, the way they reacted to his every step. These figures weren't just digital avatars. They were something more. He could feel it in his bones. The voice boomed again, this time colder, more foreboding. Welcome to the trial of existence. You are the first to make it this far. You must prove that humanity belongs here, or be erased forever. A wave of dread washed over the human. His every instinct told him to run, to hide, to seek out safety. But there was no safety here. There was no escaping this. For the first time, he understood what was at stake. This wasn't just a game. It was an existential test, one that could alter the very fabric of humanity's place in the galaxy. Meanwhile, Dr. Olanther's gaze remained fixed on the simulation screens, his mind racing. The malfunction had spiraled out of control, and he could no longer access the system's core functions. The human had reached the point where the simulation was evolving on its own, and the professor knew that if he couldn't regain control, the human would be trapped inside this rogue program forever. The reality of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. What had started as a simple test of endurance was quickly becoming something far more dangerous. The simulation had gained an intelligence of its own, and now it was playing by its own rules. He had underestimated the human's ability to adapt, and now, it seemed, he had made a fatal mistake. Olanther's fingers flew across the control panel, desperate to intervene, but nothing was working. The system had locked him out, leaving him powerless to stop the chain of events unfolding before him. His once proud creation, the very test designed to expose human weakness, had turned against him. And yet, there was a part of him that couldn't help but be impressed. The human had done what no one else could, he had managed to break through the system's defenses. There was no denying it anymore, humanity was far more resilient than anyone had ever realized. Back inside the simulation, the human began to move cautiously, his eyes darting around the strange, shifting landscape. The shadowy figures in the distance began to advance toward him, their movements slow but deliberate. Each step they took seemed to carry an air of inevitability, as though they were closing in on him, and the human couldn't shake the feeling that they were waiting for him to make the first move. The voice returned, now almost taunting. You will face your past. You will face your fears. And you will face what humanity has yet to overcome. Suddenly, the ground beneath the human's feet cracked open, revealing a deep chasm that seemed to stretch into infinity. A violent wind howled through the opening, pulling at his clothes, his hair. The figures in the distance moved closer, their eyes locked on him with an intensity that made his heart race. For a moment, the human felt a sense of hopelessness. Was this it? Was this where it all ended? But then, in the face of the overwhelming odds, something deep inside him stirred. This was the moment. The moment when humanity's strength, resilience, and determination would have to shine through. He didn't hesitate. With a burst of adrenaline, he sprinted forward, ignoring the chasm beneath him and the figures closing in on him. Every step felt like a battle, but he pushed forward, determined to show that humanity would never back down. Outside, Dr. Olanther watched in disbelief as the simulation twisted and turned, each move the human made triggering new layers of complexity. The system was no longer responding to the parameters the professor had set. It was reacting to the human's actions, and the test had now taken on a life of its own. For the first time, Olanther felt the weight of his own failure. He had tried to manipulate the human, to bend them to his will, but now it was clear, humanity could not be controlled. It was a force to be reckoned with. The human reached the edge of the chasm, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind howled around him, but he didn't flinch. He focused on the path ahead, even as the figures behind him grew closer. This was the moment that would define everything. The final test. The human's heart raced as he stood at the precipice of the chasm, the wind tearing at his clothes and pulling at his very will. Every step forward felt like a battle against something deeper, something that wasn't just physical. He was fighting against fear, against doubt, and against the very instincts that told him to turn back. The figures were close now, their presence undeniable. They seemed to emanate from the shadows, their forms flickering and shifting as if they were reflections in a broken mirror. The closer they got, the more the human realized that these figures were more than just projections. They were a manifestation of something much darker, a reminder of the challenges humanity had faced, and the cost of failure. "You have reached the final stage," the voice echoed through the cold, metallic air. "Now, face what you have feared the most. Fail here, and all that humanity has struggled for will be undone." The human took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. The message was clear, the stakes were higher than ever before. This wasn't just a test of survival anymore, it was a test of humanity itself. Could they overcome the impossible? Could they face down their own doubts and emerge stronger on the other side? He couldn't help but glance over his shoulder. The figures were almost upon him now, and he could feel their presence, like an overwhelming weight pressing in from all sides. Their eyes locked on him, and for a fleeting moment, the human felt something deep within him stir. These figures weren't just random creations, they were symbols of humanity's history, of all the battles fought and won, and the ones still to come. But there was no time for hesitation. The ground beneath him rumbled again, and the wind grew even stronger, threatening to tear him from his path. Without thinking, he took the first step forward, his legs shaking but his resolve solidifying. He didn't know what was waiting for him beyond the chasm, but he couldn't stop now. As he moved, the figures began to move with him. Their footsteps echoed in the emptiness, as if they were locked in a silent race to reach him first. The human's breath quickened, but he didn't look back. The fear was still there, but it was no longer the driving force. Instead, there was something else, something stronger, more profound. It was the knowledge that this moment, this trial, was about more than just him. It was about everyone. About humanity's future. As the human reached the edge of the chasm, the figures behind him stopped. They seemed to hover, watching him with an eerie stillness. The air grew thicker, the wind howling louder, until it felt like the entire world was holding its breath. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The figures vanished. The wind ceased. The chasm closed up, and the metallic landscape around the human began to shimmer and fade. In its place stood something entirely different. A vast, open field stretched out before him, bathed in a warm, golden light. The figures were gone. The test was over. Or so it seemed. The voice returned, softer this time, but with a strange reverence. "You have passed. Not by defeating the test, but by facing it with courage and resolve. You have shown that humanity is capable of the impossible. That is the true strength." For a moment, the human stood in stunned silence. He had expected some grand revelation, some triumphant moment of victory. But what he had learned was something much deeper, something more intimate. He hadn't won by outsmarting the test, or by escaping its grasp. He had won by enduring it. By facing his fears head-on and refusing to back down. In that moment, he realized that humanity's true strength wasn't in their ability to fight or conquer, it was in their ability to keep going, no matter the odds. Meanwhile, outside the simulation, Dr. Olanther watched in awe as the system recalibrated itself. His fingers hovered over the control panel, but he knew there was nothing left for him to do. The human had succeeded in a way that no one had ever expected, and the simulation had acknowledged it. The system's once cold walls had melted away, replaced by a profound respect for the human's journey. As the simulation's final layers dissolved, Olanther sat back in his chair, his thoughts swirling. He had underestimated humanity. He had thought they were weak, fragile, and easily manipulated. But in the end, it was their resilience, their sheer will to survive, that had triumphed. And it had changed everything. The professor knew that this was only the beginning. The human's actions had proven something to him, something that could not be ignored. Humanity was ready for more. Ready to face the unknown. And it was up to Olanther, and others like him, to ensure they were given the chance. Back in the simulation, the human stood alone in the golden light. The weight of the journey was settling on him, but so was something else, something that filled him with hope. He had been tested, pushed to his limits, and yet, here he was. Alive. Unbroken. Humanity's greatest strength is not in what we conquer, but in what we overcome. The words rang in his mind as he took one last look around the tranquil landscape. The test had been brutal, but it had shown him something he would never forget. Humanity's true strength was in their heart, their courage, and their ability to rise above. They weren't perfect, but they were powerful in ways the galaxy had yet to understand. With that thought, he took the first steps out of the simulation and back into the real world, ready to share what he had learned. And as he did, the feeling of triumph surged through him. Humanity was more than just survivors, they were builders, creators, and innovators. And the future was theirs to shape. The human emerged from the simulation, his body still humming with the energy of the trial. The golden landscape faded behind him, replaced by the sterile, metallic walls of the testing facility. The sudden shift left him disoriented, but he steadied himself, taking a deep breath. He had passed, but there was something unsettling in the air. It was as if the very world around him had changed, subtly yet profoundly. Dr. Olanther stood before him, a look of quiet awe in his usually expressionless eyes. The professor's posture was rigid, but there was something different about the way he regarded the human now. It was as if, in that brief moment, everything he believed had been overturned. "Well done," Olanther said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "You have done what I thought was impossible." The human looked up at him, still processing the enormity of the experience. He had fought through simulations, faced down impossible odds, but now that the test was over, the reality of it hit him. Humanity wasn't just strong, it was resilient in ways that the professor, an outsider, an observer, could never have understood. "I don't know what you expected," the human said, his voice hoarse from the mental strain, "but what I've learned is that we don't give up. Even when we're pushed to the brink, we keep moving forward." Olanther nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving the human. "And that is exactly what I underestimated. I thought you would fall apart, that you would crumble under the pressure. But you've done something far more powerful, you've risen." The human stood silently for a moment, his mind swirling with what had just happened. The realization that he wasn't just a subject in an experiment, he was part of something much larger, settled in. The professor, the system, the test, it all had been a carefully orchestrated process. But the most significant thing was that humanity had passed it. "Why did you do this?" the human asked, his voice steady now. "Why put us through all of that?" Dr. Olanther's expression hardened. "Because we needed to know if you were truly ready," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I've seen the reports, the data. Humans are unpredictable, volatile. But I needed to see if you could endure, adapt, and ultimately, conquer." The human's brow furrowed. "Conquer what? What were you really testing?" Olanther hesitated for a moment before answering. "The galaxy is at a precipice, a turning point. There are threats beyond our understanding, dangers that could consume entire civilizations. We've seen it happen before. And we've seen how other species react, how they fail, how they collapse under the pressure. But we've never seen humanity." The weight of his words hung in the air. The human's mind raced. What Olanther was implying was nothing short of staggering. Humanity had been tested not just for the professor's research, but for something much greater. You wanted to see if we could fight, the human said quietly, to see if we could survive the challenges ahead. Not just for us, but for the whole galaxy. Exactly, Olanther admitted, a rare flicker of respect in his voice. I needed to see if you had the resilience to handle what was coming. Because the truth is, your future is not just about your world. It's about the fate of the entire galaxy. You're going to have to face what we've been unable to handle for centuries. The human's heart raced. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. Humanity wasn't just involved in some experiment. The fate of countless worlds, perhaps even the galaxy itself, now rested on their shoulders. The stakes had just gotten infinitely higher. You don't trust us yet, the human said, a new clarity in his voice. But we'll prove it. We'll show you that what you've seen so far is just the beginning. We've been tested, and we've survived. We've faced what no one else would even dare to confront. And we'll face what's coming next, together. Olanther met his gaze, his eyes piercing. I'm not sure you understand just how high the stakes are. But I've seen enough. I'll be watching closely. As the human stood there, absorbing the weight of Olanther's words, he realized that everything had changed. The test had been just the beginning, the first hurdle in a race humanity wasn't yet ready to face, but now, they had no choice. The professor's test had revealed something profound. Humanity's strength wasn't in their ability to fight, but in their resilience and determination to keep moving forward. And that would be the key to whatever lay ahead. Back in the heart of the galaxy, far beyond the reaches of the testing facility, whispers were beginning to stir. The higher-ups, the ones who had watched the test from afar, were now making their own calculations. Olanther's revelation wasn't just a matter of scientific curiosity, it was a matter of survival. The alien races, so long accustomed to their own dominance, were beginning to realize that humanity's rise could no longer be ignored. And somewhere, in the vast, uncharted regions of the galaxy, the true threat was waiting, watching, calculating. The humans' victory in the simulation had done more than prove their resilience. It had caught the attention of forces that had no intention of letting humanity succeed. The professor may have underestimated them, but soon, humanity would face a challenge far greater than any simulation. And the true test of their strength was just beginning. The time had come for humanity's true trial. As the human stood before the professor, the weight of his actions, his purpose, and the future of the galaxy all pressed upon his shoulders. The simulation had been intense, but it was nothing compared to what was ahead. What the professor had hinted at, the galaxy's very survival, was about to unfold in ways he couldn't yet fathom. Standing in the heart of the vast, cold chamber, the human could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. Around him, alien beings far more advanced than any human, watched silently. Their eyes were filled with curiosity and trepidation, their minds filled with questions about what the outcome of humanity's rise would mean for them. Olanther, though, remained as stoic as ever. "You've passed my test," he said, his voice a soft echo in the silence. But this was only the beginning. The galaxy is on the verge of war. The ancient factions, once dormant, are awakening, and we need you to be ready. You have proven that you can endure hardship, but now you must show us something far more powerful, leadership. You must inspire others to stand with you. The human looked at the professor, a quiet determination settling into his bones. He knew that what was coming would be the greatest challenge of all. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about uniting beings from countless worlds, beings who had their own histories, their own battles, their own fears. If they were going to stand together, humanity had to lead. "I understand," the human said, his voice unwavering. "But I can't do this alone. I'm not a leader. I'm just one person, one voice among many." Olanther's gaze softened for a brief moment. You may not feel like a leader, but in times of great uncertainty, it is often the unlikeliest of individuals who rise. You have shown resilience, tenacity, and a drive that many would envy. Now, it is time for you to step into the role you never thought you could fill. Before the human could respond, the massive doors of the chamber opened, revealing a strange, darkened space. It was an arena, but not one of battle, it was a council. Alien leaders from across the galaxy stood before him, their faces grim, their eyes filled with distrust. The human had to win them over, but the challenge was overwhelming. These beings were not accustomed to being led by anyone, let alone by a human. You will need to speak before them, Olanther said, nodding toward the assembly. Convince them that humanity has what it takes to guide the galaxy through the coming storm. With no time to waste, the human stepped forward, the eyes of the galaxy upon him. The room fell silent as he approached the center. For a moment, all the fear and uncertainty vanished from his mind. He realized that he wasn't just representing himself, he was representing every human who had ever faced hardship and overcome it. And that was something no one could take from him. I don't have all the answers, he began, his voice steady, his words carrying the weight of his conviction. I can't promise that we won't make mistakes or that there won't be moments of fear. But what I can promise is this: humanity will never give up. We will never stop fighting for each other, for what's right, for the survival of our people, and yours too. The crowd murmured, and the human could feel the collective skepticism in the air. He wasn't just speaking to them, though, he was speaking to something deeper. He was speaking to the very essence of what made humanity strong. We've faced wars, hunger, oppression, and disaster. But every time, we've risen. Every time, we've found a way to push forward, no matter the cost. And that's why you should stand with us. Not because we're perfect, but because we're willing to fight when others give up. The alien leaders stood in silence, weighing his words. The human continued, building momentum. We're not looking for domination, he said. We're looking for a future where we can work together, where we share knowledge and strength. Where no one has to face the darkness alone. There was a long pause before one of the alien leaders, an imposing figure with dark skin that shimmered like liquid metal, spoke. You speak of unity, but our histories are filled with betrayal and war. How can we trust that you will not be just another fleeting empire, come to crumble when it is no longer convenient? The human's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. His moment to prove everything he believed in. We aren't here to rule, he said. We're here to stand beside you. Because, at the end of the day, our fates are linked. What happens to you happens to us. And if we're going to survive what's coming, we can't do it alone. We need each other. Not just as allies, but as something more. We need to be a family. And that starts with trust. The silence in the room grew heavy, the weight of his words settling in. And then, from the far end of the chamber, a low murmur began to spread. It was the sound of acceptance, of understanding. Slowly, the leaders began to nod in agreement. The human stood tall, knowing that they were now watching him not just as a test subject, but as a leader. He wasn't perfect, and neither was his world. But the one thing humanity had always excelled at was the ability to rise, to find hope in even the darkest of times. And as the room filled with hesitant but hopeful murmurs, the human realized that this moment, this shift in the galaxy, was the beginning of something far greater. Humanity was no longer on the outside looking in. They were at the heart of something far more important than they could have ever imagined. The real test wasn't just surviving the simulation. It was about forging a future together, where everyone had a part to play. And with that, the galaxy's future had been changed forever.